Hi, everybody. I'm Juney, co-founder and CEO of Beacon. This is the first time I'm doing this talk, so I definitely want some feedback afterwards, depending on if you guys like it or not. We're talking about organizational design at marketplace companies. It's a different tech than I think a lot of people speak about when it comes to marketplace topics. And so we'll just jump right into it. Okay, so before I get started, just want to do a quick temperature check of the audience. I'd love to see by show of hands if you've experienced any of the following. I'm a product design, engineering, marketing, whatever leader, right? I'm based in HQ and I'm getting overwhelmed by requests from our teams on the ground, whether for a marketing budget, localized collateral, market specific product features, blah, 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 right? It's driving me crazy. I'll try to explain that there's a process, getting these things done. They'll either go around me, they'll go to my team directly and sweet talk them, cajole them, threaten them to get these things done, or they'll just spin something up locally without telling me, right? Right? You might feel like that. Right? Just like tied up, you can't do anything, and yet, there's people all around you trying to work on stuff behind your back. Second, I'm working my ass off. I'm in New York, Chicago, our Jackson Hole satellite office. I'm hustling, trying to make my numbers, doing everything I can to grow our market. But every time I ask for anything from HQ, they'll put it into, where all good ideas go to die, which is the backlog. And, it's literally just, you feel like that. Lastly, I'm trying to understand my goals and how they fit into the broader company, right? But it's like spaghetti code. Budgets that roll up 5 different ways, none of which actually add up to anything like sane. And most importantly, it looks like the most important KPI that I have is actually the 21st priority for the person or the group that I actually need to work with to get this done, right? And that might feel like that. And so, just by show of hands, have you guys gone through 1, 2, or all of these situations? Yeah, like we all have, right? And so you're not alone. This is for you. And so just briefly about me before I get started. I have a software engineering background. I jumped into marketing and really never looked back, except once when I had to relearn how to code and build a company. You may have seen me in such shows as Expedia. I was at Airbnb running online marketing, at Hired as their chief marketplace officer, which ran a lot of go-to-market functions. Porch as COO, and then also spent some time as an EIR at Atomic, which is a venture studio based here. I've moved 10 times in 10 years. Yeah. Also still married. Good. Thank you. Yeah, I know, right? And last but not least, I actually moved to New York about 18 months ago from San Francisco, and I'm currently building a company called Beacon, which is in the HR and recruiting space, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So back to our regularly scheduled programming. If you think about marketplaces, and we're all either leaders in marketplaces or people who are founding marketplace companies, there are a lot of unique challenges as we scale. Josh actually talked about a lot of them in his talk. One is the chicken and egg problem, which side of the market to establish first. So the struggle to achieve liquidity, right, through transactions and thinking about clearance rate and making sure that the liquidity is enough to actually drive the progress of the market. Whether to decentralize or centralize levers that allow you to actually concurrently build multiple marketplaces at once. That could be by vertical, that could be by geo. Knowing how much and how long to invest until you get to escape velocity. A lot of times, when you're modeling out marketplace growth, you're going to be investing in the market, which impacts ROI with the hope that you're basically catalyzing the market so it can start growing on its own. Which metrics are leading or lagging indicators, and which one you should be optimizing for, et cetera, right? So. Clearly, these are issues for many marketplace companies as they go from 0 to 1 and then from 1 to N. I'll actually posit that a lot of these problems aren't organizationally driven, but they can be mitigated or exacerbated by good or bad organizational decisions. And there'll always be trade-offs as you think about, as your marketplace starts growing, you're going to have to make decisions that optimize for the kind of growth or the kind of company you want to build. And just recognizing that there are advantages and disadvantages to every approach kind of gives you like more of an eyes wide open, kind of walking into these situations and, sort of the expected outcomes. So based on my background, I decided to walk through my previous experience at marketplace companies to see if I could learn anything from the way departments are structured, how their goals and priorities were structured, or how teams work together. And so here are some of my findings. All right. So Airbnb circa 2012. This is a really interesting time in the company. It was growing really, really fast, about 5x year over year. And this is a time when Rocket Internet, which I'm sure many of you know, launched a direct competitor to Airbnb called Wimdu in March of 2011. And within a handful of months, they had hired like 300 people. So Airbnb was at a point where we were primarily HQ based here in San Francisco, and we had to have a plan of attack on how we think about global growth, particularly around Europe and Asia as well. And so we were established as a sort of an HQ based team where we had product and engineering, design, online marketing, which I ran, brand and content communications, et cetera, et cetera. But what we needed to do was establish a beachhead really quickly on how we think about growing markets. And so we ended up hiring 12 general managers, all locally in the markets, Berlin, London, Paris, Milan, Copenhagen. And that team, or those teams, were really focused on adding supply, which were new listings, activating hosts, getting them from signing up to the platform to actually being well-versed in the platform, becoming super hosts, engaging guests as well in the market when guests were actually traveling to those listings, local brand awareness, and other things. And so, at a high level, we had this challenge of, a San Francisco-based company thinking about things very functionally to now thinking about, market level growth and how we think about parallelizing a lot of the sort of the factors in the markets that actually grew Airbnb. And so from a budget perspective, we manage global spend essentially, but international or the markets teams also had their own budgets, right? And so you can imagine how that would kind of conflict at times when a centralized marketing team is trying to deploy budget into the markets. The markets have their own priorities, and maybe my goal, as trying to hit a particular global growth target is going to be, done by either increasing San Francisco by 10% or maybe increasing Copenhagen by 300%, right? Those levers are in the organization centrally, but if you're Copenhagen, you're like, you need to help me. London's going to be like, you need to help me. It becomes a big challenge in terms of figuring out how to work together. And so the advantages and disadvantages to the model, one is if you think about what Airbnb was, it was a hybrid organization, right? We had a functional organization, centralized product, design, engineering, marketing, but we also had a markets organization where we had general managers running a city or a country or multiple countries. And so weaving those two things together were difficult, but it was actually really valuable. It was at a time when Airbnb needed to grow very, very quickly. And by having a hybrid organization, we were actually able to achieve that. We hired a lot of entrepreneurial, high-energy general managers. They added a lot to Airbnb's cultural DNA, which was really, really important. And one of the values of bringing all of that energy and that discipline into the organization really quickly was that the rate of learning was extremely fast. You have 12 entrepreneurial general managers all hitting the ground at basically the same time, all learning on the job and figuring out how to activate the market. Some of the challenges that they faced were similar to each other, and so they can galvanize around these problems that they're all facing together. But some of the problems were actually very locally specific, right? And so it was really great to be able to take all that learning and create a rapid iteration process. What was even more important is that HQ was able to tap into that as well. And so as a personal example, I would work with the general managers. I would actually go into the markets and talk to the people who were on the ground. And in certain situations, we were actually able to take a lot of their learnings and go back to HQ and build an industrial strength solution to solve this problem across all of our markets. Sometimes it was that the problems were very local, and so we were partnering them on a point-to-point basis. But really going into the market was really helpful in learning that context. And some of the disadvantages were, the rapid hiring of local GMs. Sometimes it resulted in the culture kind of catching up to the growth. And if you guys have been at companies where, the teams have grown 300% year over year, you know that it's hard to digest an organization at the rate at which the culture can actually continue to remain consistent. And with Airbnb, even a company that's really focused on culture and really values its culture, we went through a little bit of that in that time period when we were growing very fast. And budget allocation was difficult to do. There's a lot of back and forth between the markets teams and the HQ teams and vice versa. And as I made a point earlier, I would have a global goal and I would have levers around how I want to grow the channels, and yet sometimes that wouldn't align with our markets teams, and that was sometimes a problem. And so here, I thought the big learning was if you have this hybrid organizational model when you're at growth stage, you can actually grow very fast and still leverage some of the learnings at scale with a functional organization. But there is risk in having those two teams tear apart if you're not careful. And the way that you can do that, the way that you can reverse that or at least mitigate that is really strict and kind of disciplined goal setting. So John Golden, friend of mine who's actually in that room over there doing an interview, put together this really awesome post around scaling Airbnb. And I think one of the things that he said, which I definitely agree with and corroborate, is actually that the pace sounds really fast, and in some ways it was, right? But in the moment where Airbnb was racing with competitors that entered the market that were also very aggressive, that aggressive approach in scaling was what probably one of many reasons, but an important reason why I think Airbnb was able to exceed and sort of out-execute its competitors. So jumping to Hired. Hired, as many of you may know, is a talent marketplace for software engineers, product managers, and designers based here in San Francisco. When I joined, we had, again, very similar to Airbnb, we had HQ teams, which were product engineering and design, marketing, some customer operations, and we were in the process of launching market teams. So Hired started in San Francisco. We then launched in New York, and ultimately we were in 17 markets when we were geographically expanding. One of the things that Hired did really well was it actually hired an expansion team, and that was led by a VP. And that person and that team actually went into the market and activated the market, right? So it was a consistent team that went from market to market and took all the learnings from every launch and took advantage of that to then make every successive launch faster and better and more efficient. And it was a really great strategy for Hired when we were going into market. And similar to Airbnb, the budget situation, the goaling situation was that HQ had these centralized budgets that were managed globally, and then they had market budgets. The difference here was that the Hired teams didn't really have a P&L at a market level. It was really more of a sales plus customer operations teams. And so there was a bit of a hierarchy in the way that budget was allocated and ultimately who made the decision around spend. So the advantages here, I mentioned the rapid market launches with Special Forces expansion team. It was really, really valuable. That team was actually able to get on the ground. And in a world where, like recruiting is a relationships-driven business, those people were able to go into a new market, build rapport with clients, engage the candidate community, throw events, and do everything on the ground that you would if you had a team like in the market right away. That team was also the team that ended up hiring the general manager and the client side team and the candidate side team. And so again, having a very consistent rubric around how to hire these people was really, really valuable. And each launch gave us the opportunity to sort of splash into a given market. Hired had a great thought leadership program as it related to diversity and inclusion. There's work that we did around software engineer salaries, the gender wage gap. And this data, which is across our entire platform, can be repositioned into different markets and used for market launches. So from a PR and a media relations strategy, those assets were incredibly valuable, and we would be able to tailor them into a given market when we launch, which is really great. And then some of the disadvantages, markets teams and HQ teams, it's difficult to connect them together, and sometimes with goaling, it's not enough. You have to over-communicate. And so there was a little bit of like us versus them mentality that kind of arose, and you have to really like nip that in the bud. And so repeatedly, we'd have to make sure that like the different organizations felt like we were all part of one company versus two separate companies that were like almost at odds with each other. And when you're running a marketplace and you have multiple sides, that can happen. When you're launching rapidly in a geographic expansion sort of way, that can happen. And it's something that we observed at Hired. Oh, and then the other thing was HQ teams tended to prioritize larger foundational projects, and that could be at odds with a market that's brand new, that's like running really fast and trying to be really, really operational and tactical, would see something that would take like 9 months to build, and they're like, we're living and dying by the day. Like, how could that, that difference in prioritization was sometimes frustrating culturally for both teams. And so with Hired, I thought like one of the learnings was this like rapid launch team, like this sort of special forces expansion team. As you're growing a market really fast, there is a way to do it in parallel in the way that Airbnb did, or you can do it serially, but have it be staggered in a sort of cohort mechanism. And doing it through this like centralized team that like jumps from market to market is maybe a good approach to tackling that. And so here, as a really kind of basic example, Hired puts out a state of salaries report every year, and what we're able to do is reposition that for the UK, reposition that for Canada, reposition that for Australia. And so using that data is valuable not just in terms of an overall thought leadership and content strategy, but as we launch markets, we can actually use it in favor of like creating assets that the media and publications will latch onto. And then last, I'm going to blow through this because I'm almost out of time. But with Porch kind of represented, even though it is a marketplace, Porch is a marketplace of homeowners and professionals that connect on jobs, large and small. Everything from a handyman job all the way to a gut renovation of your home. Porch was set up much more in a business unit environment, and so there wasn't like a markets versus functional organization clash. And so there were some advantages to that in that there wasn't like an us versus them mentality, but one of the issues was if you want to dig into markets and understand like supply and demand factors for, say, Seattle for, I don't know, air conditioning repair, right, as an example, right? There was no team, there was no person that was like really focused on that and didn't understand the levers between supply and demand to be able to ascertain or dig into any issues that, that they were finding. And so the thing about Porch was that we actually ended up building this concept of a task force. And so cross-functional groups of team members, product, growth, marketing operations would actually come together and like solve tactically a problem that might be in a market or in a group of markets. And it was really valuable, but one of the things that I feel like we could have done better was because there was no executive sponsor really driving a market-based approach, that strategy will be really, really important, and then like maybe we shift strategically and it sort of dies on the vine. And so I think that the task force model works really, really well, but you have to have either an executive sponsor or have like kind of the strategic consistency to be able to like drive that through the completion and really see the outcomes. Otherwise, that team will ultimately get, you know, sort of whiplashed a little bit, and individual people within those teams might be pulled away if like department-wise, like there's a different strategic priority that comes up. And so, you know, again, like the team kind of had trouble rallying around these like granular supply and demand calibration issues in a particular market because there was no market leader. And so there's definitely value in having a market-specific orientation from a marketplace perspective if you want to kind of drive efficiency there. And so here, one of the things I pulled out was this task force model. Like as you continue to grow and scale, leveraging task forces as an organizational mechanism can be really valuable when you don't have an actual team that's like focused on that particular vector of your marketplace. So what did I learn from that? I say one, you know, cultural unity across teams, especially between HQ and market teams, is extremely important. It's okay to celebrate being the marketing team. It's okay to celebrate being the London team. But it gets to be a problem if I'm the London team and it's the marketing team's fault, right? Or if I'm the marketing team and like Paris isn't important, you know, to us as a company. When you start to kind of see that, which is actually fairly easy for like large marketplace companies to feel, you have to really nip that in the bud early on because it can be toxic and ultimately corrupt some of the culture that you're building. Second is setting and properly aligning goals is like the #1 job for like any leader in this kind of organization. When you're setting goals and those goals either are not achievable or your #1 goal is, again, like the 21st goal of another team, it actually says that goal setting is not that important for the organization, or it says that you know, it's actually okay to like not drive really, really hard to achieve it because you're not being given the tools to actually be successful. And so spending extra time here and prioritizing alignment, very, very important. Third, there's real value in looking at the business market by market and solving problems in parallel, but not at the expense of efficient execution, unless high burn is okay. I think Airbnb benefited from this, and I think if you're a company that is growing really fast, it's important to be intentional about it, but also make sure that you're really weighing the factors between growing fast in parallel and sort of the impact that that might have. And then lastly, if you're pretty far from day-to-day execution, like if you're an executive and you're running these teams and you're not really on the ground day-to-day, going into the markets and visiting them, which is something that I did both at Airbnb and Hired, was like incredibly valuable. Really helped me understand some of the problems and challenges that the teams were facing, and I was able to take some of those lessons and actually turn them into like broader solutions that helped not only our own department be successful, but the company at large be successful. And so I'm out of time, and so the one thing I did want to show you is, you know, if you think about a team and you're a marketplace growing, this is sort of like a broad recommendation, but early stage, you're just starting out, you're maybe launching your second marketplace, and you're growing the company. One is to create a parachute team that goes in and launches markets, right? They're going to learn a lot from the first, the second, the 10th launch, and that experience and that knowledge like scales and exponentially grows. The teams that are hired within the markets as well, there's a consistency in the rubric in which you hire those people, which will be beneficial for the company. Growth stage, you have an established HQ with functional teams. Your market presence, you want to expand your market presence rapidly. The key here is like to let specific functions run. I think what worked really well at Airbnb was that the general managers had pretty broad oversight in terms of the things that they can do. And yes, there were some clashes at times with HQ, but because they had a lot of that autonomy and really had the teeth to be able to execute things on the ground, that's what actually made the local markets teams and that strategy really successful. And then later stage, when you're a company that is approaching, maybe multiple business units, right? And starting to think about complexity in the ways that those business units run, starting to roll up like city-based market leaders into a regional structure and ultimately into a vertical team that mimics more of a functional organization is probably the right way to go. And then you have a functional team that like basically can work in tandem with all of the other sort of centralized functional teams that you have in the organization. Additionally, as you start to shift that, you can use a task force concept to tackle some of the cross-departmental initiatives or focus areas. And I think with that, I'll take any questions. Yes?
Yeah, LJ at Google Cloud. So what is the makeup of the market-based team? Can you just give us the...
It's different for each company, at least the three examples that I put together. At Airbnb, it was really around like host activation. It was around supply. At Airbnb, it was the two sides of the marketplace and matchmaking. So we had teams on the ground that worked directly with candidates, software engineers and product managers who were entering the marketplace. And then we had teams directly engaging clients. And so it was really like on the ground individuals interacting with clients directly. I would generally say market-based roles tend to be more in the revenue organization for the most part, or they're going to be like field marketing.
And how did you see they bubbled up learnings from each individual market back up to HQ?
The general managers like all worked very, very closely together. And so a lot of times like they shared learnings, and then that team then, usually like general managers either report directly into the CEO or there is a person that runs like a head of international or a head of markets. And so that information like was then pushed at the executive team level and then communicated to the leadership team. But in some examples, I would go into the markets themselves and I would actually, just through conversation and working with the teams locally, like extract a lot of that learning. Yes.
How did you best balance kind of the functional and the regional roles in terms of reporting lines? So would there be two direct reports, solid lines, solid and a dotted? What kind of management structure worked well as these companies grew?
That's a really good question. What generally happened was as the functional teams matured, we started to go down a path where you might have like a head of marketing, and then underneath that team, there might be certain channel teams. So let's just say for sake of argument, a head of marketing, and then like a head of like acquisition, head of retention. Those teams would then be broken out regionally. And so those regional like manager level team members would then interact with the general managers, like marketing or operations representative, and that's how things would link up. And I think that worked well. But usually we didn't come to that conclusion right away. And building out that organization is pretty heavyweight if you were to do it like, on day one. And so, yeah. Time's up. All right, thank you so much. Appreciate it.